Good evening, everyone, and welcome to City Budgets Made Simple, How Philadelphia Plans and Spends Your Money. I'm Tanisha Beju, Program Director at the Committee of 70, a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to strengthening democracy and civic engagement here in Pennsylvania. I'll be your moderator for tonight's discussion. Before we begin, a quick note again, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the Committee of 70's YouTube channel for anyone who wants to revisit the discussion or share it with others. So, what does the city budget have to do with civic engagement? Short answer, everything. The budget funds many of the services that shape our daily life, from schools and public safety to street repairs and parks. And yet, many residents don't know how it's decided or how to make their voices heard. And tonight, we hope to change that. This is going to be the first in a three-part series on the city budget. And tonight, we'll cover where the city's money comes from and how it's spent, who makes these decisions, as well as the budget's overall timeline, and ways to get involved and advocate for your community. Tonight, I'm joined by two fantastic speakers and fellow dog owners, my colleague Andrew McGinley, VP of External Affairs at Committee of 70, and our good friend Phoebe Bachman, facilitating artist at the People's Budget Office, a project of Mural Arts Philadelphia. We also encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar. We've built in some time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. Before we dive in, can I turn it over to you, Andrew, and then you, Phoebe, to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having us, and everyone who's here virtually. Thanks for joining us. Always good to see you, Phoebe. I'm excited for our conversation today. We're going to try to cover a lot. So if you have questions, we'll do our best to get to all of them.
Well, it is great to be here. Thank you for having me. And honestly, just super happy to be able to talk about the budget with some fellow nerds. It's something I care about very deeply. And so love to when we can get in the weeds together. But yeah, as you said, I'm a facilitating artist for People's Budget Office, which is a project of Mural Arts Philadelphia. It's been going on for about 5 years. We educate folks about the city budget, provide opportunities for advocacy, and imagine what a fully funded city could look like. So thanks so much.
Thank you both. I'm so excited as a fellow nerd. So let's get started. Phoebe, I'd love for you to set the stage by explaining, like at its most fundamental level, like what do we mean by the city budget? What does it contain? And then how might we, beyond like the quick overview I gave, how might we see it impact our daily life?
Yeah, great question. Well, I always like to say that the city budget is more than just numbers. It's a reflection of our city's values, our priorities. It's really a story of the city. And I think something that's really important to note is that it is a plan, it is a law, and we often refer to it even as a moral document. But it's a plan with a price tag, and I think federal budgets especially have been in the news recently. So it's also really important to know is just like there are many different types of budget, and the kind of budget that we're talking about today is one focused on our municipal funding, so our city government. And so in terms of, how we think about it, the budget is actually divided into two main documents, and there are also smaller budgets outside of that, but these are the two that we focus on because they're kind of the two that are most important to how they provide funding for our citizens. And so those are the operating budget and the capital budget. And so I can go into a little bit more depth about what each of those has. So the operating budget funds day-to-day services. So that's your salary, that's, the health services, trash collection, libraries, programs, but it's also our debt servicing. So this is an annual budget. It repeats basically every year. We need to create a new one. The capital budget, on the other hand, is something that happens over a longer term. So it covers long-term projects like repairing roads, infrastructures, things like rebuild. So, really helping repair the city, especially because we have a lot of, infrastructural issues across the city. And so basically the budget requires that we have a balanced budget. And so this really means that our revenue needs to equal our expenditures, aka the money that we get in through taxes and fees and grants needs to equal what we're spending out. And this is unlike something like the federal government, which can run at a deficit. And I think the only other thing I would like to note, just in terms of a basic understanding of city budget, is that we are both a city and a county, which means that we also have additional costs that we have to cover because we also are a county. So this includes some healthcare costs, this includes our jails, and this is a bit different than other cities that have larger counties outside of that city, which can help cover some of those costs.
So the balance, the mandates to have a balanced budget comes from the Philly Home Rule Charter,
Yep, exactly.
which many people may know from the start of those lovely questions that we see when we go to the ballot. And we're like, may the Philadelphia Home Rule Charter be so amended? And it's like, what is that? So Phoebe, what
Is that?
it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a charter that sets out the workings of our city. And so, of course, that includes how our finances work. So there's oftentimes things that have to be passed through the Philadelphia Home Rule Charter in order to actually be implemented. That's kind of on a basic high level.
No, that's exactly where this 101 is going. And I love that you said that too, that it's at a high level, because there are some parts like the next section when we talk about revenue where we'll talk in a bit more specificity, but we really don't want people to feel that there was like some pre-reading that needed to be done for this webinar ahead of time. So Andrew, that leads me to my next question about revenue, or the money that the city collects to fund some of the services that Phoebe mentioned. So our revenue comes mainly, not exclusively, but mainly from three key taxes: wage tax, real estate tax, and business tax. Can you walk us through each of those?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get a little wonky here. I apologize in advance, but talking about taxes is a little complicated. But I think it's, one of the pieces that I think is important to remember is that when we talk about tax revenue here in the city of Philadelphia, that's money generated from us, right? This is our money. We're generating this to the city in a lot of different ways. And so when we think about the city budget and how the money is being spent, it's really important to remember where that money comes from. And that's all of us and the businesses here in the city of Philadelphia. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the most obvious taxes or the largest taxes here in the city. There are different taxes and fees on different programs, but obviously one of the ones we hear the most about is the city wage tax. And that is basically an income tax that is charged to your paycheck every check. And it's depends on where you live. So if you live and work in the city of Philadelphia, you're charged one rate. If you work in the city and you live outside of it, you're charged a different rate. But that wage tax has been historically a pretty big issue for a lot of people here in the city. It is one of the largest drivers of revenue for the city of Philadelphia. If you combine the wage tax with the net profits tax, that's like a third of the city budget, third of the revenue that the city gets each year. So it's a huge amount of money. And there has been a concentrated effort over a couple of different mayoral administrations to decrease that wage tax. And we'll see where that lands in the future, but that it has been decreased over a couple of different administrations in the past. Real estate taxes is, those are your property taxes, right? That's what's charged. If you still have a mortgage, you typically pay that through your mortgage company. Otherwise, you pay a bill directly to the city of Philadelphia. And that is a huge driver of income for both the city and the school district. And so real estate taxes were paid by the owners of the property directly to the city. There are some ways for folks to either be protected from, if you're, a longtime resident who may be on a fixed income. There's a loop program, the longtime owner occupied property deduction. So that helps folks maintain their properties. And then there's also the tax abatement, which has been controversial in the years that, was for a lot of new development that the city was building over a couple of decades. The other big real estate related tax is the real estate transfer tax. That's an important component of the city of Philadelphia. And that applies to the sale or transfer of real estate located in Philadelphia. The tax becomes payable when the property deed is filed with the Department of Records. And the city actually gets like, I'm sorry, is that $315 million from just that real estate transfer tax. So that's not your property tax that you're paying because you own your house and you're using city services, but that's on the transactions related to real estate. So that's another big driver. And real estate revenue is a sixth of the city budget, really. So that's a very, very large chunk of city revenue and spending. And then business taxes. We, Phoebe and I had a pre-conversation about this. We know, and if you've read the news this week, we know that business taxes are going to be a big part of the discussion on the budget process this year, giving a little preview of future sessions to come. But those are the taxes paid by the business community in Philadelphia. I think it's important to just note that at the beginning of this council session, Council President Johnson reestablished the Tax Reform Commission. And there have been a couple different iterations of the Tax Reform Commission, I think over the last 25 years or so. And they were tasked with evaluating Philadelphia's business tax structure, with the idea that the tax structure for how businesses pay taxes in the city of Philadelphia is an impediment to businesses being located in the city. So they've issued some preliminary recommendations, just I think yesterday or the day before. And I would imagine that will be a pretty big part of the conversation that happens around the budget this session, because it is such a big revenue driver for the city, and it is so controversial in terms of how you balance the need for that tax revenue with the need to encourage businesses to grow and hire people here in the city of Philadelphia. There's a couple of other things that we should talk about when we talk about business taxes quickly. First is our sweetened beverage tax, or the soda tax. That was established by Mayor Kenny, and that goes to fund Rebuild. I think we already talked a little bit about Rebuild and some of those early childhood education programs here in the city of Philadelphia. That is also not without controversy, that tax. And I think there are hearings that are going to be organized by City Council this session to look at how that tax has been implemented over the last couple of years and see if there should be changes made. That's separate from the Tax Reform Commission, just to be clear. That's a program that's initiated by Councilmember Harity. And then of course, sales tax, right? When we purchase things at stores, we all pay sales tax. So that's the one you probably see the most often. And that helps generate a lot of revenue for the city of Philadelphia.
So I'm about to, not that we all didn't take in every single moment, but I'm a visual person too, which is why we have the incredible Phoebe here to help. I just dropped in the chat our How Philly Works guide, because page 17 does a nice little breakdown of not just the three big drivers of revenue that Andrew mentioned, with wage, real estate, and business tax. It also breaks down the other components. So that's page 17 that you'll see on there. But after this session, both Phoebe and I will send out to your emails additional resources for you related to the budget.
I just wanted to flag a couple of other sources of revenue. I feel like I'm getting very, very wonky, which is why I'm wearing my big glasses today. But there are other, not just tax-based revenues that come into the city budget that I think are important. One is direct federal aid that comes to the city through a couple of different programs. The landscape there is unclear for this year. I mean, to be honest, we've seen a lot of changes on the federal level. So that will be something that I know that the city and all the different organizations here in the city are going to be monitoring, but there is some federal aid that comes directly to the city. But more importantly, the city receives revenue from the state. And again, that's revenue generated by Philadelphians paying taxes to the state. It's not like the state aid, but it is revenue from the state coffers that come to the city. And then finally, we have some of our local agencies. When you pay your parking tickets, that is generating revenue for the city of Philadelphia. You should pay your parking tickets if you get them. And of course, when you pay your gas bill, there is some revenue generated through the Philadelphia Gas Works as well. So those are smaller pieces of the budget, but all of them are really important and they all work together. So like, you can't just say, oh, we're not going to do this thing anymore, or it's not important, because each of these dollars that comes in fund important programs across the city of Philadelphia.
And again, I love Phoebe with the wonderful visual of the additional revenue that she's going to put into the system. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Oh, I didn't even see that. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's going back into the bucket.
Another thing that's really helpful for me are just like real life experiences. And so all of this is in anticipation, this whole series is in anticipation of the mayor's budget address next month. But if we could just think of the tough decisions that other mayors have had to make in recent years, maybe if one wants to talk about something that Nutter faced, and then another talk about definitely Mayor Kenny during the pandemic, that would be awesome.
Phoebe, do
And
you want to start with Mayor Kenny since I just talked for so long?
yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I guess we'll go recently. So, I mean, I think something important that I always point out in our Budget 101s is that because we rely so heavily on the wage tax, when we face high unemployment like we did during COVID, a lot of people are laid off. All of a sudden, the city is losing a ton of revenue. And so then you have, a real big issue because it's just like, what are the services that we're able to provide because we've just lost this huge chunk of revenue. And luckily, we were able to get in money through the American Rescue Plan, which was federal funding, and that was for, a very specific amount of time. And it's allowed us to really maintain a lot of programs and also increase our rainy day fund, which is essentially our fund to be able to draw on during hard times. So we might end up having to draw on it over the next few years anyways. But, I think what Kenny did is, his response was like, okay, well, I'm going to cut services. And that came to, talking about cutting parks and recreation, cutting funding for libraries. He completely zeroed out the arts, and as an artist myself, I think that was particularly difficult to witness. And on the other side of this was this incredible response from grassroots organizers and unions who were just like, you can't cut these services. These are essential services that we need to maintain. And so I think that, even though a mayor might propose drastic cuts, there are people listening, there are people working to make sure that those essential services remain intact. But hasn't always been that case. And I guess, in the case of Mayor Nutter, we, had some really big cuts that affected our city deeply.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the point that Phoebe raised at the beginning of the discussion where she talked about, we can only spend the money that we have. We can't do deficit spending like the federal government does. So back in 2008, then Mayor Nutter faced, globally, the economy shrank dramatically, and there were real impacts on the city of Philadelphia through the wage tax, through real estate tax, all of those different revenue drivers were impacted across the entire city. So, Mayor Nutter had to come back to the city 6 months into the budget and just recognize that the budget that they had passed in June was not going to be the budget for the rest of the year because there was just no money. There was a 6-month shortfall of $100 million. So really a lot of money. And, he had to make pretty drastic cuts across the city to make up for that. And we talk a lot about services and reduction of services, but when you talk about reduction of services, you're often talking about the reduction in staff, which is not a choice that anyone wants to make lightly, but there were a lot of decisions that had to be made there. And Mayor Nutter actually had to lay off 200 city workers and also cut 600 open positions from the city workforce. So that was about 800 positions eliminated out of about 23,000. And that included 200 Philadelphia police officer open positions. So there were huge impacts to all different segments of the city. And those are pretty dramatic cuts. And when we think about like what could happen if the economy shrinks or if there's if shortfalls in other areas, like there are limited tools for city government to handle those things. And back in 2008, I think basically every city in the country had to face similar tough decisions. But there were long-term impacts to the city of Philadelphia. I mean, if you look at some of the different programs that got eliminated, street sweeping got eliminated. And that's something that still hasn't really come back, or Mayor Parker has started to bring back, I should say. Reductions in libraries, reductions to parks and rec. And once you cut money, you can build it back over time, but it's not like you can just drop all those funds back in the next year. So it's really tough when that happens.
And Andrew, you brought us to like a really good place to talk about the timeline, because you mentioned the budget gets passed in June, and then you mentioned how Mayor Nutter had to come back 6 months later. And I think that also, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are here with us tonight because of Mayor Parker's upcoming budget address. And yet, that's not where the process actually begins. So I'd love to kind of shift gears and just break down how the budget process works. And if we could start, Phoebe, with you telling us, like, I guess we'll use the mayor's budget address as like a before and after. So Phoebe, if you could tell us what happened in the fall and winter leading up to the address, and then Andrew, if you can do what comes after.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the budget actually is happening year round. Even though we call this like budget season, I think it's just when it's most visible because of the hearings that are happening, which Andrew will talk about. But our city operates on a fiscal year schedule that is from July 1st to June 30th. And so that means our new budget needs to be in place before June 30th so that it can start and we can start spending July 1st. And so over the course of the summer, that is when kind of documents come together in terms of detailed assessments of what is actually in the budget. They put together these really amazing detailed budget books that are thousands of pages long, but really go into every single line item where the city is spending. And so those come out over the summer. And then city departments in the fall put together a wish list of their spending. And so we use something called performance-based budgeting in the city. And so that means that they have programs that are happening throughout the year that they apply various metrics to. And so they set certain goals for, and they're saying, okay, how well are we meeting these goals? How much can we increase our budget to better meet those goals? Or if we're not meeting those goals, where do we potentially need to cut within our departments? And so they'll meet with budget analysts from the budget department to help kind of determine those things and talk through what should be on that wish list, what is realistic for them to propose. They may also be in conversations with the mayor's office about what is realistic for them to propose based off of what the mayor expects them to do. And so after they put together those wish lists, those go to the budget office. The budget office takes all of those and they look at what is our predicted revenue. So as I mentioned before, our revenue has to equal our expenditures, or expenditures have to equal our revenue. And so basically what they need to do is think about how much money are we going to get into this year? What are people going to be paying in taxes? What are we potentially getting from other state governments? What are we getting maybe in fees? What are we getting from grants? And so they put together a sense of, okay, this is how much revenue we're going to have. And now these are the expenditures that we can meet. And so they'll start to make a proposed budget and they'll work very closely with the mayor's office to make a budget that aligns with her priorities. And so as we are leading up to this time right now, then the mayor will give a speech, which we like to sometimes call a State of the Union address. It's really, the time of year where the mayor stands up in front of city council and they say, these are my priorities for the year. This is what I want to focus on within this budget cycle. And these are the budget items that helps kind of meet that goal. And that pretty much then aligns with what the departments have proposed, though it might be off a little bit from what maybe their eventual wish list would be. All right, Andrew. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say it was great in December to see to piggyback off of the State of the Union, to have the state of the city.
Yeah.
In December, to have the mayor just reflect back and see like what was able to be met, like what are the goals moving forward. So it's a really nice way, Phoebe, as you said, this is not just the law, it's not just a financial document, it's also just like the kind of moral document or compass for how the city is moving forward. And so, Andrew, once we get the next wave of that, the next budget address, like what happens afterwards?
Yeah, sure. So a budget is a law or a package of bills, depending on how it all works exactly. But essentially, like any other piece of legislation, it has to be passed by city council and then enacted by the mayor, right? That's our good little separation of powers process that we have on the state level, as well as on the city level, as well as the state and federal. So Mayor Parker will give her budget address to council. She'll lay out her plan. She'll talk about her priorities for the year. And then it moves over to council. And city council has a really active role because they're the ones who actually fine tune the budget. They create the document, working closely with the mayor's budget office, but also their own internal budgeting team and their CFO. And council will have a couple of different steps that they'll take. One is hearings, right? And so every city department that Phoebe just talked about, as well as all of the different row offices, so like our controller, register of wills, or sheriff, they will all come before city council and they will provide public testimony and they will answer questions from members of city council in a public forum. So that is a great, very public, transparent process where you can see, and sometimes you're reading sort of between the lines or reading tea leaves in that discussion about like what people want and what people are expecting. But it's a very public process where people can come and you can sit, you can watch, they're all live streamed. And so those hearings will take place over a couple of weeks. These are long days for council and staff. I have to say, as a former appropriations staffer out in Harrisburg, those hearing days are tough, but you often get fed, which is nice. So, you know, these are chances for members of city council who may or may not support the mayor's plan for the year, right? They can ask tough questions of all of these different department chairs, of members of the mayor's administration, about the materials they submitted and about all the different priorities for the year. So that will take place over a couple of weeks. And then there's a somewhat quieter phase of budget where we're not necessarily in public hearing mode. And I should also say, like, you can go to those hearings, you can provide testimony at those hearings. There's lots of opportunities. I think Phoebe's going to get into that a bit later. There's lots of opportunities for you to engage. But you can, sorry. So once those hearings close, then there's a little bit of negotiation between the council and the mayor's office on a lot of the different priorities. Just because Mayor Parker proposes something in this budget process doesn't mean that council will enact it, right? They have the authority to do what they want, and the mayor will be able to sign the bill or veto the bill, but that doesn't typically happen. It's typically signed because there's a bit of a negotiation over what new revenue projections look like, what council says they can and cannot live with. And that's where all those important steps of advocacy come in, because that's where you can really impact the budget process by highlighting to your members of city council what's most important to you. And then the other piece I want to add is there's a slight wrinkle this year because of this tax reform commission, which isn't an annual thing, but they are rolling out recommendations. And I think it's important to know that, you know, since Council President Johnson set that up, council had a lot of authority in deciding who was on that commission, as did the mayor and some of those row offices. I think a lot of those recommendations are probably in line with what they expected, right? So I don't think there is anything shocking in the recommendations that have come out so far, but it'll remain to be seen exactly how those recommendations impact the draft budget and then what council ends up enacting.
So there were two things that I just put in the chat that people will have noticed. One is our quick and easy budget infographic, just like a nice reference point for many of the people in timeline that we have mentioned so far. But I also dropped in the council budget center. Phoebe, this is something that you often encourage people to go and reference. Can you just walk people through what they might see or why they should check the council budget center?
Yeah, so this is kind of our like central information point during this part of budget season. There isn't really a great place yet until we launch our own website that has all of the information in one place. And so when council, after the mayor gives their address, then council will come up with a hearing schedule, as Andrew mentioned, and that hearing schedule will actually be posted to this website. So it will be in a kind of document form that someone may forward to you, or council might post on their own Instagram or something of that nature. But then they'll actually put it in a kind of digital format on the website. And under that, when each department goes up to give their testimony, they'll have to upload a prepared testimony and then also a detailed budget. And so this is, again, where we get like really nerdy or really into the weeds, is like, if you want to know what that department is actually proposing, because, you know, the mayor will come out and we'll see these really big numbers, like $80 million going to Parks and Recreation or $800 million going to the police department. But you don't actually know what is in that until they come up and they give their testimony. And so that's what I find is really important. And so when you go to that website, especially after the mayor gives their address and when these hearings are starting to be posted, you can find that information. And then also, if you're not necessarily watching as it's happening in real time, then you can also watch YouTube videos that are recordings of the testimony as well, which I think can be really helpful. And as Tanisha and Andrew mentioned, you can go yourself. You can go like while these testimonies are happening and listening to them in person. This is a space for you to be able to occupy as well.
Yeah, I just also, as Phoebe mentioned, one of the limitations of those hearings is that they happen during the day typically.
Yeah, they're
So
like Tuesdays and Wednesdays from 10 to 4 p.m.
yes, and I should have noted that earlier when I was talking about them, but like the fact that they're uploaded online is a really useful resource because it does allow folks who are, at work during those hours or just busy during those hours to engage in a lot of this material.
So we
Yes.
have a question that's in the Q&A, which I think is really great to talk about now, because our next two, we're about to do a shift into like, with all the wonkiness, outside of being a nerd who really wants to like learn about all these pieces, like we're going to shift into like why everyday residents and citizens here should care and like should get involved. The question though is great, and Andrew, I'm gonna direct it to you. Someone has asked, can you speak to the power of city council members during the budget process? Like, for example, does an at-large member have equal say as the 10 district council people?
That is a great question.
It really is. That's why I was like, ooh, we're gonna break protocol, answer this one early.
I mean, officially, and then like in terms of the votes, right? The value of the vote, a bill has to have the votes regardless of whether a person is a district council person or an at-large. So their votes are equal. The slight difference is that I am very sorry. I have a very rambunctious puppy here. The difference is that district council people may be able to elevate priorities that are specific to the neighborhoods that they represent. So they may be speaking more about the things that are happening in their neighborhood and what the priorities are for that neighborhood. But each council person will be able to make the case that certain things should be added to the budget. You wouldn't be shocked to see that. And in the at-large people still have that same role, right? Because they still live in the city. They may have neighborhoods or specific areas of interest or communities that they really feel like they need to represent in this budget. So they all will have equal votes and they can all help shape the budget dramatically. Again, just because Mayor Parker proposes something, council could, in theory, enact something totally different if they were all working together, and they could, theoretically override a mayoral veto if needed. But the reality is there'll be some flexibility from the initial draft from the mayor, and then folks will be able to impact it directly.
And I'll also add that like each council person is putting together a list of their top priorities. And so those are all being collected by the council president. And so they'll have an opportunity to kind of go through those and see like how many, people have prioritized a certain aspect of the budget. And with that, I will also say the appropriations committee maybe holds even more power in this sense. So there are certain council members who are on the appropriations committee. And so they just have more power to negotiate around the budget process than everyone on council.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
There was like a follow-up that had asked about the committees. Like should the focus be on the committees that the council people chair? Like, and so that's something that maybe we can chat about when we talk about reaching out to whether you're going to go to a public hearing or whether you want to reach out to one of the council members, if we can make sure to just follow up and talk about who to reach out to for what issue. But Phoebe, again, like why should residents get involved in this process if we hear that, we have the different departments working on their budget, just assessing everything, pulling it all together, submitting it to the mayor goes through it, council goes through it, and it's like, what can I actually do? Like, why should I get involved? Are there, again, any real life examples that you can give of, people having an impact?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's your tax dollars. So, like, you should have a say in what your government does with the money that you're providing to them. And, the way our budget process is currently set up now, it's not that participatory. There are much more participatory processes in other city governments, in other countries as well. But, I think we do what we can with the tools that we have. And so, one of those things is at a very basic level, going and giving public testimony. Council wants to hear from you. I think it's really important, especially if you know what district you're in, to talk to your district council member, but then also to go in person and give public testimony during the budget process, which will be at least 2 to 3 days where they'll listen to public testimony. You'll only have about 2 minutes to give your spiel, but it will be on the record. And, there's power in numbers. So I think there's really amazing groups like the Alliance for a Just Philadelphia, which has been doing organizing and advocacy work around this. And you can actually go to their trainings and learn how to give public testimony in a way that is, will have the most impact. And I think just to know, it's just like there's billions of dollars going to these various services. And so it's just really important that you do care about what is happening in your city because that's affecting you every day, whether it's the school that your kid goes to, it's the pothole that you got that flat tire from, it's the transportation that you're riding, it's the trash that's getting picked up, it's the library that's closing next to you because they don't have enough funding to stay open. I think all of these things affect our daily lives, and it's just important to show that we do care about them because they are what makes our neighborhood and our city rich. So over the years, there's been incredible campaigns by various groups that have really advocated to keep services running. And, I would say first and foremost, this includes Friends of the Free Library. They have done an amazing job at organizing when they organize across all of the over 50 branches of the library across the city. And they have just done incredible campaign work to make sure that residents are engaged around those libraries and that they're also coming down to City Hall to give testimony and to do direct actions in front of City Hall, whether that's a press conference or whether that's actually, doing a protest as they, might need to do depending on the situation. I'd also say during Kenny's administration, when he cut the arts out, there was No to Zero for the Arts, which was also an incredible campaign, which did art performances in front of City Hall. They did protests throughout the streets. They organized calls and emails, just really drilling in on what is effective in terms of making sure that council is listening to you. And I will just say that one thing else that I've noticed over the years is when these different groups work with union workers as well. I think the ties between those who are actually providing the services in the city and those who are receiving the services is very important. And so there's been really amazing campaigns where they've worked together in concert to make sure that people are being well paid within the city and that folks are then receiving the services that they need.
Can you repeat that first organization that you mentioned that helps to train you? Because I think that would be something that like that popped up in the Q&A, but I also want to make sure to lift that up for everyone because I think that's a very invaluable resource.
Yeah, it's Alliance for a Just Philadelphia. So they work primarily with a coalition of organizations that are already part of the Alliance, but we're going to be doing an advocacy training that's open to anyone this spring as well. And they've had resources that they've published before that are public testimony guides.
Yeah, that would be great if when we do, whether we do individual or a collective, just a follow-up email, we'll make sure to have our resources as well as a link for Alliance for a Just Philadelphia.
I just wanted to add to the point Phoebe kind of started with that this is billions of dollars going to lots and lots of different services. And like we kind of conceptually can understand that, but also the fact that it's so much money going to all these different things can be so overwhelming as like a just everyday citizen. So one of the tools that we rolled out at 70 last year that was so helpful, just even for me to like really understand the city budget, was breaking down the city budget by person, right? So saying how much per person are we spending on all of these different services? based on what the mayor proposed and then what was enacted. And I think this is just a great resource, and that's still public online, published online through the Citizen, the Philadelphia Citizen. But that's something that we did last year that I think was so helpful to really help me understand like where all the dollars are going per resident of the city of Philadelphia.
Yeah, and we'll have that updated again this year. So that'll also be another one that's in there. And it's not just for every adult, or it's for every single resident, which I think is so incredibly like visually stunning to see how much is spent. So then the final question that I have for both of you is how to get involved. So Phoebe, you already mentioned like there are some organizations that will help to train people. We've mentioned generally um, like the public hearings for testimony. But Phoebe, if you can give us like a few simple ways, again, in the follow-up email, we'll make sure to include these, but what can people do if they want to get involved and have their say in this $6 billion budget?
Yeah. So I'd say, we offer Budget 101 and 201 trainings every year through the People's Budget Office. So we'll be sharing the dates of those. Those are in-person trainings where we're talking folks through basically what we went through today with some more slides, some interaction where you can, really dig into how the budget works, what the process is, and why your voice matters. And then the 201s are really focused around specific issues in the budget. So if you're interested in learning more about how taxes work, which is going to be a very big conversation, as Andrew mentioned this year, super important. Or if you're interested in learning more about the funding that goes to police and prisons, or the funding that goes to education, we'll be offering a bunch of those trainings, and those will all be online, so hopefully accessible to attend. And then we also have a space down at Love Park. We call it the People's Budget Office. It's our own space where you can come and visit. We're open on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from 12 to 6 after April 6th, 18th. So you can come visit us. You can meet with our artists and residents who are digging into different aspects of the budget. We can do a little research together. We can help you prepare your public testimony. It's just really meant to be a resource space. And I'd say, at the end, it's like join with people who have similar issues that they're facing. You can go and speak about education all by yourself, but it really makes a difference if you bring 10 of your friends with you. And so I look at the different organizations, and when we share out some of this information, you can kind of see what organizations are working around these various campaigns, but see which ones resonate with you, and see if you can join those to just, really add your point to that. And I think, Andrew, you're going to talk about public testimony, so I don't need to.
And then also too, how to contact your council member. And again, that earlier question about being strategic with who you reach out to.
Yeah, I mean, so just want to, we've talked a lot about public testimony, but one of the things that you should remember is that like, that's not, those budget hearings aren't the only opportunity for you to engage. You can contact your council member at any time about the issues that are important to you, not just about the budget, but about issues in the city that impact you directly. And previously, my first job in government was to answer those emails, open those letters, take those phone calls for a district council office out in Norristown. So it was on the state level, but it was very, very similar. And I can tell you that like those things matter, right? They matter to the elected official, they matter to the staff. So if you are worried about the playground in your neighborhood, you don't have to wait to the budget to say we need more funding for Parks and Rec. You can be contacting your council person throughout the year saying, hey, the swings are broken. Hey, this is really a mess. Hey, we really need help here. So that when they are looking at the budget, that can be one of their personal priorities. So you can help set the table throughout the year. Just like the mayor is gathering information from the departments, council people are going to be gathering information from their constituents. And then the other piece that I want to say about that is council members are responsive, right? Like they read those messages and they hear them and they try to be. I recently wrote to the council president, I live on Pine Street. There's talk about making the bike lane more protected in front of my house. I love it as someone who bikes most places. So I wrote, not as a staffer at Committee of 70, but just as a resident in the district. And I got a phone call like immediately saying like, hey, here's what we're working on. Here's what we're thinking. Like they really care about this stuff. So I do think you will get more of a response than you're expecting. But if you do decide to go testify publicly, that is excellent. And I think, the biggest tip is 2 minutes goes very quickly. And I'm sorry, this puppy is out of control. 2 minutes goes very, very quickly. And you are not there because you're an expert, right? You are there because you're a resident, you have a personal experience, and you need to make it that really clear. They will have lots of experts come and testify. But if you are there to talk about your personal experience, don't worry about knowing every fact and figure about the issue. Know your experience and personalize that testimony as much as you can, right? Why does this matter to you, to your family, to your neighborhood? Because that's the kind of messaging that resonates. There's lots of research you can reference. You can provide that over email. I wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about like some big research project. I would really focus on like what matters to me and what matters to my family rather than focusing on like some big sort of national trend here.
And if Cowboy will allow a follow-up question, so if I, because of time restrictions, feel like it's better for me to reach out to city council via their website, should I just focus on my district council person, or should
Right.
I reach out to all 7 at-large people? Should I like be strategic about that?
I mean,
The best bang.
I think like reaching out to those 7 council members who represent the entire city, that means they represent you, regardless of where you live, regardless of who you are, regardless of your like, if you disagree with them on stuff, there is no reason to not reach out to them. And reaching out to your district council person is a great place to start. And you can say like, hey, I live here. You also may know an at-large council person lives near you, for instance. So like that would also be a, hey, I'm your neighbor. This is something that matters to me a lot. And there was that earlier question about like committee, what committees people are on, and that absolutely is important. And can be really useful because a lot of, if they're chairing a committee or on a committee, they may have a personal interest in that topic. It could be education, it could be public safety, it could be any of these different areas that the city has committees on. You can reach out to them and say like, this is an issue that matters to me. And in that case, there's no reason you couldn't send like a similar email to all of the members of that committee, like to know, not just your district council person, not just your at-large members, but if they're a member of a committee that has that you share a particular interest in, you can reach out to them. They represent the city. Like there's no reason not to. And then the last thing I would say is a lot of advocacy is online, and that's great. But if you're sending an email, try to not just use like the form, type in your address and hit send kind of email, like personalize it, make it real, because they'll absolutely be tracking like, oh, we got 50 form letters from the bike coalition, right? And that's helpful. But they're also going to say like, oh, we got this one from this person that's about like their personal experience and why that's important. So I think, personalizing that email is just as important as personalizing that testimony.
And I'd like also add to that is you can be creative too. If you do have the time and you have the desire, like the Domestic Workers Alliance did this incredible campaign last year where they're, trying to get more funding for the Office of Labor, and they brought Valentines to different council offices. And I think that's just like really important to think about, okay, what is also going to speak to hearts and minds? It's like, sometimes it is, yeah, an email that's sharing your personal story. That's amazing. Sometimes writing a handwritten letter, sometimes sending a postcard, sometimes making a drawing, sometimes having your kid make a drawing. Just really think of the ways that can just stick out and represent your experience. And look, I'm not going to say that everything works, because I think it's also important to note that like sometimes, and we've seen this a lot, especially in relationship to the arena in the last year, there's incredible campaigns where they're not listened to, but it doesn't mean that they aren't important. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't take the time to make your voice heard, because it does ultimately make a difference in the long run.
So then, speaking of making your voice heard, this is a perfect time for people who are still with us to drop any of their questions in the Q&A. We spoke to that amazing question about the power of city council members during the budgeting process. We talked again about the training for testimony. We got another message that said to make sure to follow up with the resources, and that would be great. There's one here that says, what would a more participatory budget process look like? So, Phoebe, are you aware of any that where people do have a greater say, or there is a more dynamic, interactive
Yeah.
process?
For sure. And I would butcher details, so I'm going to give you some broad strokes. But there's a couple of countries, I mean, I will say in France and in Spain, some of their cities do amazing programs where usually there's an amount allocated towards participatory budgeting. And then citizens can actually come up with proposals that they find are important. So that might be a proposal for a new playground, that might be a proposal for better education programs, maybe proposals for something else. And then folks will vote on those proposals. And in the States, we have a participatory budgeting project organization that actually trains different municipal governments around the US in how to do participatory budgeting. So usually the first step of that is getting together a group of advisors who can, one, advise on the process, what would make this more participatory in this specific government context. And then they'll think about, okay, can we allocate a certain amount of money to start piloting this? So Philadelphia was actually going to pilot this. They had consulted with this participatory budgeting process, and they were going to do $1 million under the Kenney administration. And they ultimately decided that before they could even figure out allocating $1 million, which I know sounds like so much money, but at the end of the day, when it comes to the budget, it's just really not, that they needed to get more information. And so they actually started to do more focus groups and research as to what citizens really wanted. And it started this whole engagement process that really provided a lot of data. But I think if we were to move in that direction, it would be really gathering feedback from folks and then giving them a certain amount of money that they could actually allocate towards projects that they want to see. Because that's the true democratic process, that they have the ability to really say what these direct funds go to.
And I know that the town halls that both the council members and the mayor had, they had these surveys where people just like voted on just like responded in the survey to like what would they be more interested in, what initiatives under the safer, cleaner, greener idea like would they be interested in. And so that is really hopeful that our opinions will be solicited more and more, and hopefully we'll be able to do a participatory process like you mentioned. I don't see any other questions that are in here. I know that I have my marching orders in terms of sharing out this link for people to reference. Again, definitely our How Philly Works guide that will talk about the big buckets, where the budget goes, the operating budget specifically. Also the infographic that I dropped in the chat. Andrea and I are working on some resources for how to give public testimony, like a small infographic, as well as how to contact your city council person. So that will also, info for that will be in there, as well as a link to last year's budget breakdown per resident. And again, that's going to be living on the Philadelphia Citizen website, and will be updated in the next few weeks. So that's what we're excited to contribute. Phoebe, I know you have so many resources because you've been breaking down the budget for so long. Are there ones that you're excited to share that are like top of mind for you?
Yeah, we're coming up with a Budget 101 brochure, which will hopefully kind of reflect what we talked about today. And we'll also have a survey for folks to fill out so that they can share more of their budget priorities. And we're going to be putting that into a People's Budget Report that we give to City Council as well as the administration. We also have a youth activity guide. So if you have young folks in your life and you want to start introducing these topics to them, that's a good way to do that. So we'll be sharing that. And then we are going to have a bunch of in-person events over the course of the next few weeks, next few months. And one of the things I want to highlight is that we do have these incredible artists in residence who are thinking about the budget more creatively. So if you're an artist or you're involved in creativity, please come down to our People's Budget office, because that'll be a really good way to kind of engage in this process. We want to make this more transparent. We want to make it accessible, but ultimately we also want to make it playful. I mean, it's something that affects our lives. So we should find ways to find joy and, interest in it.
I mean, that's why Andrew brought his fur baby cowboy to tonight's session, to inject some fun and joy.
Some chaos, that's for sure.
No, we don't want that in our budget. No, thank you. If you did not get your fill of cowboy and you would like to see her again, you can expect this recording to be posted on Committee of 70's YouTube first thing in the morning. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Huge thank you to Phoebe Bachman for joining us. And Andrew, thank you so much for your expertise. I'm going to ask you two to just hang out for a second so we can take a nice little photo for the YouTube. I forgot to do that beforehand, but thank you to everyone for joining us so much. We appreciate you, and we will let you know when the second part of our budget series is going to occur, and we hope to see you then. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Is Cowboy, so Andrew's Cowboy just hungry? Is she like, Dad?
No, she just wants attention. She's been fed, she's been walked. She's just
So
she's
she
just
wanted to testify?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
always.
Adorable. Thank you again to everyone. All right, so before I end, let me go ahead and stop our recording.